Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the corner of the war room, her crisp navy uniform perfectly pressed despite the early morning hour. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the massive table where senior officers huddled over satellite images and tactical maps. She was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years, and definitely the only woman among the dozen men discussing the mission that could change everything. "The target is here," Colonel Davidson pointed to a spot on the map with his thick finger. "Intelligence suggests they're moving weapons through this corridor every Tuesday night. We need someone inside to confirm the route and timing." Sarah's heart raced as she listened. This was exactly the kind of mission she had trained for, but as a lieutenant fresh out of the academy, she knew her chances of being selected were slim. The other officers nodded and murmured among themselves, completely ignoring her presence in the corner. "What about sending Rodriguez?" suggested Major Thompson, gesturing toward the map. "He's got experience in that region." "Rodriguez is still recovering from his last deployment," Davidson replied, shaking his head. "We need someone clean, someone they won't recognize." Sarah felt her palms growing sweaty inside her white gloves. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, countless hours in training that most of these men could never imagine. But she remained silent, knowing that speaking out of turn could end her career before it really started. The discussion continued for another hour as the officers debated various approaches to gathering the intelligence they needed. They talked about surveillance equipment, extraction routes, and backup plans. Sarah memorized every detail, her mind automatically cataloging the information in case she was ever called upon to use it. As the meeting began to wind down, Sarah noticed something the others had missed. The satellite image showed a small service road that connected to the main corridor, hidden by a cluster of trees. It was the perfect vantage point for surveillance, close enough to gather detailed intelligence, but far enough away to avoid detection. "Sir," she said quietly, then cleared her throat and tried again louder. "Colonel Davidson, sir." The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at her, some curious, others annoyed at the interruption. Davidson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that the young lieutenant had spoken up. "Yes, Martinez? What is it?" Sarah stepped forward, her legs feeling like they might buckle under the weight of everyone's stare. "I noticed something on the satellite image, sir. There's a service road here that might provide better cover for surveillance." She pointed to the spot she had identified, trying to keep her voice steady. The officers leaned in to look, and she could see some of them nodding as they recognized the strategic value of her observation. "Interesting," Davidson murmured, studying the image more closely. "That could work. Good eye, Lieutenant." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but it was quickly followed by nervousness as Davidson continued to examine the map. She had drawn attention to herself, which was both good and potentially very dangerous. "You know what?" Davidson said suddenly, looking up at Sarah with a calculating expression. "You're about the right size and age to blend in with the local population. Have you had any field experience?" The question hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. She could feel her secret pressing against her chest like a physical weight, threatening to spill out if she wasn't careful. "Some, sir," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Basic reconnaissance training, survival skills, weapons proficiency." What she didn't mention was that her basic training had actually been some of the most advanced and brutal preparation the military had to offer. She couldn't tell them about the months of underwater demolition training, the hand-to-hand combat instruction, or the psychological conditioning that had pushed her to limits she didn't know existed. Davidson nodded approvingly. "What do you think, gentlemen? Lieutenant Martinez knows the area from her analysis. She's observant, and she's certainly not what anyone would expect for this type of operation." Sarah tried to read the faces around the table, but the officers kept their expressions carefully neutral. She knew they were weighing the risks and benefits of sending someone so inexperienced on such a critical mission. "She's awfully green," Major Thompson said finally. "This isn't exactly a training exercise." "Sometimes green is exactly what we need," Davidson replied. Fresh eyes no preconceptions, and definitely no reputation that could compromise the mission. The debate that followed felt like it lasted forever, though Sarah knew it was probably only a few minutes. She stood perfectly still, trying not to show how desperately she wanted this opportunity, while simultaneously terrifying herself with thoughts of what could go wrong. Finally, Davidson made his decision. "All right, Martinez, you're our inside observer. Report to Major Chun for your briefing at 0600 tomorrow. This mission is classified at the highest level. You don't discuss it with anyone outside this room." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, snapping to attention again. "Thank you, sir." As the meeting broke up and the officers filed out of the room, Sarah remained standing in the corner, trying to process what had just happened. She had gotten the assignment she wanted, but now she faced the challenge of completing it without revealing the skills that would make her perfect for the job. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was probably the most qualified person in the entire building for this type of mission, but she had to pretend to be a barely trained lieutenant who had gotten lucky. One slip, one moment where her real training showed through, and everything she had worked for could come crashing down. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah's mind was already working through the mission parameters. She would need to be careful, competent enough to succeed, but not so skilled that she raised suspicions. It was going to be the performance of her lifetime, and the stakes couldn't be higher. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, Sarah wondered if she was making a huge mistake. But deep down, she knew she didn't really have a choice. This was what she had trained for, what she had sacrificed everything to achieve. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the most dangerous game she had ever played. Sarah arrived at Major Chin's office 15 minutes early, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The hallway was empty except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of boots on linoleum. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing through possible scenarios and complications. When Major Chan finally arrived, he looked surprised to see her waiting. He was a compact man with graying temples and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Sarah had heard rumors about his background, special operations, multiple deployments, the kind of experience that made junior officers nervous. "Punctual. That's good," Chin said, unlocking his office door. "Come in, Martinez. We have a lot to cover and not much time to do it." The office was sparse and functional, with maps covering one wall and a secure computer terminal in the corner. Chin gestured for Sarah to sit in the metal chair across from his desk, while he pulled out a thick folder marked with classification stamps. "Before we begin," Chun said, studying her face carefully, "I want you to understand what you're getting into. This isn't a training exercise or a routine patrol. One mistake could get you killed, or worse, compromise an operation that's taken months to set up." Sarah nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Understand, sir." Chin opened the folder and spread several photographs across his desk. They showed a small town nestled in a valley, with narrow streets and buildings that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. Sarah recognized the area from the satellite images, but these ground-level photos revealed details that hadn't been visible from above. "Your cover is simple," Chin explained. "You're a graduate student doing research on local architecture for your thesis. It's boring enough that most people won't ask too many questions, but it gives you a reason to be walking around with a camera and taking notes." He handed her a worn backpack and a camera that looked like it had seen better days. "Your real job is to monitor this intersection." He pointed to one of the photos, "every Tuesday night between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. We need to know who's moving through there, what they're carrying, and where they go afterward." Sarah examined the photographs, automatically noting sight lines and potential escape routes. The intersection sat at the bottom of a hill, with narrow alleys branching off in 3 directions. It was actually a clever location for illegal activity, easy to escape from, but difficult to observe without being noticed. "How long do I have to establish my cover?" she asked. 3 days, Chin replied. "You'll take the bus into town tomorrow morning and check into the boarding house here." He pointed to a building on one of the photos. "Mrs. Kowalski runs it. She's been cleared by our background team, but she doesn't know anything about the real purpose of your visit. Chun continued the briefing for another hour, covering everything from communication protocols to emergency extraction procedures. Sarah listened carefully, asking questions when appropriate, but mostly absorbing the information. She noticed that the communication equipment was more sophisticated than what a lieutenant would normally be given, but she didn't comment on it. Your handler will be Agent Miller, Chun said, sliding another photograph across the desk. It showed a middle-aged man with a forgettable face and thinning hair. He'll be posing as a traveling salesman. You'll meet him at the diner every morning at 8 a.m. for breakfast. Normal conversation, nothing suspicious. Sarah studied Miller's photo, committing his features to memory. Something about the setup bothered her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The operation seemed almost too simple, too straightforward for something that required this level of classification. "Sir," she said carefully, "what makes this particular route so important? There must be dozens of ways to move contraband through that region." Chin's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Approval, maybe, or surprise that she had asked the right question. "Intelligence suggests this isn't just ordinary smuggling," he replied. "We think someone is moving advanced weapons technology, possibly to hostile foreign agents. If we're right, this could be a matter of national security." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy blanket. This was bigger than she had initially thought, and the stakes were higher than just gathering intelligence on local criminals. Chun handed her a civilian ID card and a bus ticket. "Study these documents tonight. Tomorrow you become Jessica Miller, graduate student from the university. Everything you need to know about your cover identity is in this file." Sarah took the documents, noting how thoroughly they had constructed her fake identity. Jessica Miller had a complete background, college transcripts, a thesis proposal, even a social media presence that went back several years. Someone had put serious effort into creating this cover. As she prepared to leave, Chun stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you weren't our first choice for this mission. You're young, you're inexperienced, and honestly, some people think we're making a mistake." Sarah felt her heart sink, but Chun continued before she could respond. "But you spotted that observation point that everyone else missed, and you asked the right questions today. Sometimes fresh perspective is exactly what we need. Don't try to be someone you're not out there. Trust your instincts, follow your training, and remember that your job is to observe and report, nothing more." Back in her quarters, Sarah spread the cover documents across her desk and began memorizing every detail of Jessica Miller's life. She practiced the signature until it looked natural, studied the thesis proposal until she could discuss it convincingly, and even researched architectural terms she might need to use. But as she worked, her mind kept drifting to the real. Jessica Miller stared back at her, a young woman with curious eyes and a slightly nervous expression, exactly what a graduate student on her first real research trip might look like. But beneath that carefully constructed surface, Sarah Martinez carried skills and knowledge that could complete this mission in ways that would shock her superiors. The question was whether she could succeed without letting that truth slip through the cracks. As the bus pulled away from the base, Sarah settled into her seat and watched the landscape roll by. In 3 hours, she would be Jessica Miller, and the real test of her abilities would begin. She just hoped she was ready for what she might find in that small town, and what she might have to do to protect the secret she carried. The bus wheezed to a stop at the edge of town, and Sarah stepped off into the afternoon heat carrying her worn backpack and camera case. The driver barely looked up from his newspaper as she gathered her things, and within minutes the bus had disappeared around a bend, leaving her alone on a dusty road that led into the heart of the small community. Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house stood 3 blocks from the bus stop, a 2-story building with faded blue shutters and a porch that sagged slightly under the weight of too many winters. Sarah knocked on the front door, mentally rehearsing her cover story one more time. "You must be Jessica," said the elderly woman who answered the door. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and flour on her apron. "I'm Mrs. Kowalski. Come in, dear. You look tired from your trip." The interior of the boarding house was clean, but dated, with worn furniture and the smell of home cooking drifting from the kitchen. Mrs. Kowalski led Sarah up a narrow staircase to a small room with a single bed, a desk, and a window that looked out toward the intersection Sarah would be watching. "The rent includes breakfast," Mrs. Kowalski explained, setting Sarah's bag on the bed. "Dinner is extra if you want it, but there are several restaurants in town if you prefer to eat out." "You said you're studying our old buildings." Sarah nodded, pulling out her camera and notebook. "For my master's thesis. I'm particularly interested in how architectural styles changed here between 1920 and 1950. This area has some beautiful examples that haven't been modernized." Mrs. Kowalski beamed with pride. "Oh, you'll love the old courthouse then, and the Miller House on Elm Street. My late husband always said those were the finest buildings in 3 counties." For the next hour, Sarah let Mrs. Kowalski give her an informal tour of the town's architectural highlights, all the while memorizing the layout of streets and noting potential surveillance positions. The old woman proved to be a treasure trove of local information, chatting about which buildings were oldest, which families had lived where for generations, and which areas of town were best avoided after dark. "Now, you be careful walking around at night, dear," Mrs. Kowalski warned as they returned to the boarding house. "We've had some trouble lately with strange folks passing through town. Nothing dangerous, mind you, but the sheriff says it's best to be cautious." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of trouble?" "Oh, probably nothing serious. Just people who don't belong, if you know what I mean. Strangers in expensive cars driving through at odd hours. The sheriff thinks they might be using our roads to avoid the highway patrol." Mrs. Kowalski lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think they're smuggling something, but Joe, that's Sheriff Hendricks, says there's not much he can do without proof." That evening, Sarah ate dinner at the local diner and had her first meeting with Agent Miller. He was exactly as forgettable as his photograph suggested, discussing fertilizer prices and weather patterns like any traveling salesman might. But when he mentioned that his samples would be arriving by truck on Tuesday night, Sarah understood that the operation was moving forward on schedule. After dinner, she walked through the town center with her camera, taking legitimate photographs of buildings while familiarizing herself with the area around the target intersection. The streets were mostly empty except for teenagers hanging around the drugstore and a few older men sitting on benches outside the barber shop. As she walked past the intersection for the 3rd time, Sarah noticed something that hadn't been visible in the satellite images. There was a small maintenance shed behind one of the buildings that would provide perfect cover for observation. Better yet, it was positioned so that someone inside could see 3 of the 4 streets that converge at the intersection. She was examining the shed more closely when she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah turned to find a man in his 40s watching her with obvious suspicion. He wore work clothes and a baseball cap, and his hands were rough from manual labor. "You taking pictures of that old shed?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes alert. Sarah forced herself to smile naturally. "Actually, I'm more interested in the brick building behind it. Look at those corner details. They're typical of 1930s construction in this region. I'm doing research on local architecture for my thesis." The man stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of motor oil and cigarettes. "Thesis, huh? You're a student." "Graduate student at the university," Sarah replied, holding up her camera and notebook as evidence. "I know it probably seems weird to be taking pictures of old buildings, but some of these structures are really unique examples of their period." She launched into a detailed explanation of architectural features, using the technical terms she had memorized the night before. After a few minutes, the man's suspicious expression began to soften. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head. "Never thought about buildings that way. I'm Pete, by the way. Pete Johnson. I run the garage down the street." "Jessica Miller," Sarah replied, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you." Pete shook her hand with a grip that confirmed his profession. "You be careful wandering around at night. Jessica, this is usually a quiet town, but we've had some unusual activity lately." Nothing dangerous, probably, but you never know. After Pete left, Sarah continued her architectural photography tour for another hour before returning to the boarding house. In her room, she reviewed the photos on her camera's display screen, noting that several actually showed good angles of the target intersection. Anyone checking her camera would find exactly what they expected from a graduate student studying buildings. But as she prepared for bed, Sarah's mind was focused on the upcoming Tuesday night. The maintenance shed she had discovered would be perfect for surveillance, but getting inside it without being noticed would require skills that Jessica Miller, graduate student, shouldn't possess. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the small town settling in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove by with its radio playing softly. Normal sounds of a normal place where nothing dramatic ever happened. Except that in 3 nights, if the intelligence was correct, someone would be moving dangerous weapons through that intersection just a few blocks away. And Sarah would be there to watch, hidden in the shadows, gathering the information that could prevent those weapons from reaching their intended destination. The irony of her situation struck her again. She was probably the most qualified person within 100 miles for this type of surveillance mission. She had been trained to move unseen, to observe without being detected, to gather intelligence in hostile territory. But she had to pretend to be an amateur, a college student who had stumbled into something bigger than she understood. As sleep finally began to take her, Sarah's last conscious thought was wondering whether she would be able to complete the mission without revealing who she really was. In 3 days, she would find out just how good her acting really was, and whether the skills hidden beneath her cover were as sharp as they needed to be. Tuesday night arrived with unexpected rain, turning the dusty streets into slick ribbons that reflected the sparse streetlights. Sarah sat in her room at the boarding house, watching water stream down her window, while checking her watch every few minutes. At 9:45 p.m., she would need to make her way to the maintenance shed she had identified 3 days earlier. The past 2 days had been spent establishing her cover more thoroughly. She had photographed dozens of buildings, filled pages of her notebook with architectural observations, and even struck up conversations with several townspeople about local history. Everyone she met seemed to accept her story without question, treating her like just another harmless graduate student pursuing an obscure academic interest. But underneath her carefully maintained cover, Sarah had been conducting her real reconnaissance. She had memorized the patrol routes of the local police, identified which houses kept their lights on late and which went dark early, and located at least 3 different escape routes from the target area. Most importantly, she had figured out how to get into the maintenance shed without being detected. At 9:30, Sarah changed into dark clothing and soft-soled shoes. She tucked her camera and notebook into a small backpack, along with night vision equipment that was definitely not standard issue for graduate students. If anyone questioned the specialized gear, she would claim it was borrowed from a friend who was into birdwatching. The rain provided perfect cover as she slipped out the back door of the boarding house and made her way through the narrow alleys toward the intersection. Her movements were silent and purposeful, staying in the shadows and avoiding the pools of light cast by street lamps. Without conscious thought, she found herself using techniques that had been drilled into her during months of intensive training that Jessica Miller had never received. The maintenance shed was exactly where she remembered it, tucked behind the old brick building that housed the town's small post office. Sarah approached from the blind side, checking carefully for any signs that the area was being watched or that someone else had discovered her intended hiding place. The lock on the shed door was old and simple, the kind that could be opened with basic tools by anyone with minimal training. Sarah had it open in less than 30 seconds, using a technique she had learned during a course that officially didn't exist. She slipped inside and carefully closed the door behind her, leaving just a crack for observation. The interior of the shed smelled of old motor oil and fertilizer. Garden tools hung from hooks on the walls, and bags of mulch were stacked in one corner. But what made it perfect for surveillance was a small window that faced directly toward the intersection, positioned at exactly the right height for someone crouching behind the bags of mulch. Sarah settled into position and activated her night vision equipment. The intersection came into sharp focus through the rain, every detail clearly visible despite the darkness. She checked her watch, 9:58 p.m. If the intelligence was accurate, she wouldn't have long to wait. At 10:17, the first vehicle appeared. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, moving slowly through the intersection as if the driver was looking for something. Sarah photographed the license plate and noted the make and model, though the night vision equipment made it impossible to see inside the vehicle. The sedan made 2 more passes through the intersection before parking in the shadows beside the old courthouse. 2 men got out and stood beside the car, clearly waiting for something. Through her night vision scope, Sarah could see that both men were armed, with handguns visible under their jackets. At 10:31, a pickup truck approached from the opposite direction. Unlike the sedan, it moved with purpose, heading straight for the intersection without any hesitation. The truck pulled up beside the sedan, and Sarah watched as the driver got out to speak with the 2 men. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but Sarah could tell from their body language that something was wrong. The men seemed agitated, gesturing toward different streets and checking their watches repeatedly. Finally, the truck driver shook his head and climbed back into his vehicle. But instead of leaving, the truck began making a systematic patrol of the area around the intersection. Sarah realized with growing alarm that they were conducting counter-surveillance, checking for anyone who might be watching their operation. If they were thorough enough, they would eventually check the maintenance shed. She had 2 choices: abort the mission and try to slip away before they discovered her position, or stay hidden and hope they didn't think to check the shed. Either option carried serious risks, but leaving now would mean losing the intelligence that the entire operation was designed to gather. The decision was made for her when she heard footsteps approaching the shed. Through the crack in the door, Sarah could see a man with a flashlight moving between the buildings, checking each potential hiding place methodically. He was good at his job, and she knew he wouldn't miss the maintenance shed. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to hide behind the bags of mulch and hope he didn't look too carefully, but the space was too small and open for that to work. She could attempt to slip out the back of the shed, but there was no rear exit, and climbing through the small window would make too much noise. That left only one option, and it was exactly the kind of move that Jessica Miller, graduate student, would never be capable of making. The man was 3 steps from the shed door when Sarah made her decision. She positioned herself beside the door frame, controlled her breathing, and waited. When the door swung open and the man stepped inside with his flashlight raised, Sarah moved. Her strike was precise and silent, hitting the pressure point at the base of his neck that would render him unconscious for at least 20 minutes. The man collapsed without making a sound, his flashlight clattering to the floor. Sarah caught it before it could roll away and quickly switched it off. She had acted on pure instinct, using skills that had been drilled into her until they became automatic responses. But as she looked down at the unconscious man, Sarah realized the magnitude of what she had just done. Jessica Miller could never have taken down an armed operative with a single precise strike. The technique she had used was taught only in the most advanced military training programs. If this man remembered anything about his attacker when he woke up, if he reported what had happened to his associates, the entire mission would be blown. Worse, they would know that someone with serious combat training was watching their operation. Sarah quickly searched the man's pockets, finding a radio, a backup weapon, and identification that confirmed her worst fears. These weren't local smugglers or small-time criminals. The ID was fake, but it was the kind of high-quality fake that only intelligence services could produce. She was dealing with professionals, possibly foreign agents, and they were moving something far more dangerous than ordinary contraband. Through the window, she could see that the sedan and pickup truck were still in position, but now their occupants were getting restless. They were probably expecting their scout to report back, and his silence would soon trigger an expanded search. Sarah made a decision that went against every principle of covert surveillance. Instead of trying to remain hidden and complete her original mission, she activated her emergency beacon. Within minutes, extraction teams would be converging on the area, but by then, the weapons dealers would probably be long gone. As she prepared to leave the unconscious man in the shed and make her way to the extraction point, Sarah caught sight of something that changed everything. A third vehicle was approaching the intersection, a military transport truck with government plates. The weapons weren't being sold to foreign agents. They were being stolen from the U.S. military by someone with access to official vehicles and authentic documentation. This was bigger than smuggling. It was treason at the highest levels. Sarah raised her camera one more time and began photographing everything she could see. License plates, faces, the contents of the truck as it was unloaded. She had already blown her cover by taking down the Scout, so there was no point in maintaining the pretense of being a harmless graduate student. But as she focused on gathering the crucial intelligence, Sarah failed to notice that her unconscious captive was beginning to stir. The precise strike that had dropped him was wearing off faster than she had calculated, and his eyes were starting to open just as the sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the streets. The next few minutes would determine whether Sarah's mission was a success or a disaster, and whether her carefully guarded secret would finally be exposed to the people who had trusted her with this assignment. Everything depended on what happened when that man woke up and saw her face. The man's eyes focused on Sarah's face just as the first police sirens became clearly audible in the distance. She could see the confusion in his expression as he tried to process what had happened, and she knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before he would be alert enough to cause serious problems. Sarah made a split-second decision that would haunt her for weeks afterward. Instead of trying to subdue him again or attempting to flee, she leaned down and spoke directly into his ear. "You never saw me," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of command training. "You slipped on the wet ground and hit your head. That's all you remember." The man's eyes widened as he recognized something in her tone, something that told him he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than she appeared. Without waiting for a response, Sarah slipped out of the shed and disappeared into the maze of alleys behind the post office. The extraction team found her 6 blocks away, crouched behind a dumpster with her camera and notes clutched tightly against her chest. They were professionals, asking no questions as they bundled her into an unmarked van and drove rapidly away from the chaos that was erupting around the intersection. By the time they reached the safe house 20 miles outside of town, the radio chatter was painting a picture of the night's events. The weapons transfer had been interrupted when local police responded to reports of suspicious activity. 2 arrests had been made, but the military vehicle and most of its cargo had escaped. Most importantly, no one seemed to be looking for a graduate student who had been staying at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house. Major Chun was waiting in the safe house conference room, along with several other officers that Sarah didn't recognize. Their faces were grim as they reviewed the photographs she had taken and listened to her verbal report of the evening's events. "You did good work, Martinez," Chin said finally. "The intelligence you gathered confirms that we're dealing with an organized theft ring operating inside the military supply chain. Those photographs will help us identify the individuals involved and trace where the stolen equipment was headed." Sarah nodded, but she could feel the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. Chin's praise fell hollow because she knew she had compromised the entire operation with her actions in the shed. "There is one complication," Chin continued, pulling out a transcript of police radio communications. "One of the suspects claims he was attacked by someone with advanced combat training. He insists it wasn't an accident, despite having no memory of who his attacker was." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. "What kind of training?" asked one of the officers Sarah didn't recognize. Chin consulted the transcript. Quote, "Professional level hand-to-hand combat. Knew exactly where to hit to cause unconsciousness without permanent damage. This wasn't some amateur who got lucky." End quote. Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations, but She knew that any story she told now would have to be at least partially true to be believed. The men in this room were experienced enough to spot a complete fabrication. "Sir," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something that wasn't in my official file." The attention in the room focused on her with laser intensity. Chen leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Before I joined the regular Navy," Sarah continued, "I spent 18 months in a specialized training program. It was classified, and I was told never to discuss it unless absolutely necessary for mission success. The lie came easily because it was built on a foundation of truth. There had indeed been 18 months of specialized training, though it hadn't been before she joined the Navy. It had been in addition to her regular service, preparing her for assignments that didn't officially exist." "What kind of specialized training?" Chen asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision that would either save her career or destroy it completely. "SEAL program, sir. I was part of an experimental integration initiative. The program was discontinued after my class graduated, and we were reassigned to regular duties with instructions to keep our additional training classified." The silence that followed her confession lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sarah could see the officers exchanging glances, processing this new information and its implications for everything they thought they knew about the young lieutenant they had sent on a routine surveillance mission. Chen was the first to speak. "That would explain a lot," he said slowly. "Your observation skills, your ability to handle yourself in a dangerous situation, and why you were able to gather intelligence that more experienced officers might have missed." Sarah nodded, grateful that he seemed to be accepting her explanation, but terrified of what would come next. "It also explains," Chun continued, "why you were able to take down a professional operative without killing him or leaving evidence of a struggle. That level of precision requires training that very few people receive." One of the unknown officers cleared his throat. "If Martinez has SEAL training, why wasn't she assigned to a mission that could make better use of those skills?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading, because the real answer would expose her entire fabrication. She couldn't tell them that she actually was a SEAL, currently serving in a unit so classified that most people in the military didn't know existed. "The integration program was considered a failure, sir," she replied, sticking as close to a plausible truth as possible. "The brass decided that mixing women into SEAL units created too many complications. We were reassigned to regular duties and told to keep quiet about our training." Chun studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. But finally he nodded. "Well, whatever the circumstances of your training, it saved the mission last night. Without your actions, we would never have gotten the intelligence we needed to uncover this theft ring." The debriefing continued for another 2 hours, covering every detail of the operation and its aftermath. Sarah answered their questions honestly when she could and carefully when she couldn't, walking the tightrope between revelation and deception that had become second nature to her. As the meeting concluded, Chin pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I don't know all the details of your background, and, frankly, I don't want to know. But I will say this. You handled yourself like a professional last night, and you got results that more experienced operatives might not have achieved." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Chin's praise meant a lot to her, but it was based on a story that was only partially true. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "I just did what my training taught me to do." "That training," Chin said with a slight smile, "whatever it really involved, seems to have been excellent. Don't be surprised if you find yourself getting assignments that make better use of your particular skills." As Sarah left the safe house and began the journey back to base, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. She had successfully completed a dangerous mission, uncovered a major security breach, and managed to protect her deepest secret by revealing a smaller one. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. The story she had told about experimental SEAL training would follow her for the rest of her career, opening doors to assignments and opportunities that would test her abilities in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Most importantly, she had learned something valuable about herself. She could live a double life, maintaining her cover while using her real skills when necessary. It was a dangerous game, but it was one she was apparently very good at playing. The only question now was how long she could keep playing it before someone discovered the truth about who Lieutenant Sarah Martinez really was and what she was truly capable of when the stakes were high enough to justify revealing her hand.